And I am pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, the Honorable Jim Brand. He spent 9 years as a family court judge, 20 years at the Supreme Court judge, and then recently 4 years as our own town justice here in the town of Clinton. So without further ado, Jim.
Thank you, Craig. I'd like to thank the Clinton Historical Society and certain people in it, Cynthia Koch, Craig Marshall, of course, and Elliot Werner, who spoke to me about saying a few words. Actually, though, so far as Elliot, I have to share with you that the Rymph family was second choice. We really wanted somebody else. He can share with you who it is later on if you want to, a very famous person, but I finally got him to go along with the Rymph family, and frankly, Elliot, I've gotten over it. I don't even know that anymore. I don't even think about it. So I truly hope tonight that, if nothing else, you should have a goal for yourself. My goal tonight is that you'll learn at least one thing about the town of Clinton that you did not know before. And I don't know how many of you folks know John and Gloria Golden. In Hyde Park, they are like the quintessential folks who would, if you had in the dictionary a picture of community service, it would be them. And I've known John Golden all my life. He knew my mother, Marguerite Rymph, my grandfather, James Rymph. And I mention all this because they also have a fireside chat in Hyde Park. And if you ever see it advertised, do not miss it, because they have programs, whether it be on women's suffrage. He was good friends with the Roosevelt family, or on slavery. If you see it, do not miss it. So I got a call from John a couple of years ago, and he asked if I would be good enough to come to the fireside chat and talk about the Rymph family. And I told him no. And the reason I told him no, and it may sound a little bit silly because we're such good friends, I'd never thought about the Rymph family. I know my mother's a Rymph, my grandfather's a Rymph. There's boxes in my office that my mother had left to me when she passed away about the Rymph family I'd never looked at. Frankly, I didn't think about it any more than I did about brands. And so I didn't know an awful lot to talk about. And I think also because my view on life is that each of us come into here with a couple of bookends, the beginning and the end. And it's up to us to make the difference in what people will think about us at the end of the day. So, you know, I didn't think about it. And people were asking me about living on Rymph Road. Your mother's a Rymph, your grandfather. And I would kid them and say, yeah, I've gone nowhere in life. I'm still there. And then he had Sue DiLorenzo give me a call. And I don't know if any of you folks know Sue. She lives in this town. We have a special relationship with Sue because I've known her many years. Her son Todd and my son Jay and Ron, who's here tonight, were best of buddies in high school. And unfortunately, both Todd and my son Jay were involved in tragic accidents and died before they graduated. So we've had that kind of bond over the years. And I couldn't say no to Sue. So that forced me to go into the office, get out these boxes, and go through them. And I learned things about the town and about my own family that I never knew. And I have to thank them for it. And I will circle back to that just at the end of my talk. So how does all this begin? Well, in the early 1700s, word was out that Queen Anne of England was giving passage to folks who wanted to come to America and be part of the process, join in and settle here. Well, as it turns out, she hadn't really promised that, but she did come through helping people. So there's a certain persecution of what were then the Palatines in Germany, and they came here to the United States. Amongst that group were that you would care about in this town were the Rymphs and the Cookinghams. And they came to Ulster County, to Dutchess, Columbia, below Germantown, and all got to know each other. Kind of interesting, the names are spelled in a whole variety of ways. And just sticking with Rymph for the moment, it might be R-I-M, R-Y-M, R-Y-M-P-H, things of that nature. The first one to come here that we know with the Rymph family was in the 1700s with that group, Johannas Rymph. He comes here, changes his name to George, and which is not unusual, by the way. There was recently a judge in our county who was born Gustav and changed it to George because he thought politically it might be a little better for votes. And it was true, he won. So in any event, the Rymphs come here, and George becomes the dominant name of the Rymph family. Once I started doing research going back, there was George and James on the female side, Mary, and even coming down to my generation, James, my sister Mary. But going down, I mean, just so many of them trying to do any kind of research about the family becomes difficult because it's George N, George L, George Jr. And I mean, if you think, George Foreman had anything on us with naming kids, he would probably copied from us. And my grandfather used to tell me a lot of stories about the Rymph family. I'm so glad I had that time with him. When I was a young person, 8, 9, 10 years old, we would have a bud reunion every year because it was the Rymphs, the Buds, the cooking hands. And at the Netherwood Church, there would be a cookout. I cannot begin to tell you how much I hated it. When you're a young kid, you can't get out of that room fast enough once you've had your fried chicken and go outside and play. And today, how I wish I had a recording of it all because of the history. So what I have instead is from my grandfather, who got it from his father and grandfather. The box was in the office that I opened. And outside of Johannes, when he came here, not too surprisingly, his wife's name was Mary. And the word was that Mary was the most drop-dead gorgeous woman in the colony. And I heard that a number of times from my grandfather, how beautiful she was, also what a smart person and really strong character. And I can just tell you, being an attorney, you like to look for proof of things when you make a statement. And unfortunately, there are no pictures from back in those days from 1730, 1740. So I started looking for all the little stuff. Well, Johannes and Mary had 11 children. So obviously, he found her attractive. So I started to look, I thought, well, okay, let's see when the children were born. We had long, cold winters back in those days. So, but no, they were born all during the year. So it kind of, for me, said, okay, so she's an attractive woman. And, excuse me, they come here and they purchase land along the Hudson, right next to where the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club is. And it comes from people who are part of the Bards, which some of you may know, the patent originally with all the landowners divided up into certain patents, roughly 10,000 acres. And Johannes Rymph purchases land along the Hudson, and now is the time for me to see if I can actually get things working here. Nope, gotta go one back. So this shows the Hudson River, generally the lots along the Hudson River that they purchased, and in particular, the ones that are circled. And I don't know if you can read it that well, but George Rymph, and it's misspelled R-I-M. As I mentioned, they spelled the names in a variety of ways back in those days. He purchases land, but what goes to the strength of his wife, Mary, is that she also purchases land in her own name and actually spells the last name correct. So she not only purchases land right next to his, but actually owns more than he does. So that kind of goes towards the thing, because in those days, women just did not have title to land. That's the way it was. And I can tell you from having researched deeds over the years, even into the 1950s, 1900s, down in our clerk's office, you'll see deeds that'll have Robert Jones and his wife hereby convey. Doesn't have her name. Now she has to sign at the bottom, but it's not even up at the top. So that's just the way it was.
Can I interrupt? We have a technical problem. This doesn't belong here. Does anybody know how to get rid of it? Please?
It's not going to bother me. The people now apparently cannot see it at home.
Is that true?
No, they can see.
They can't see the yellow box plot.
Do I care?
It's a protective line.
I ignore the middle piece. And by the way, that's not my fault. So, still there? No, it slowly disappears as you go slide by slide.
Yeah, it does.
So,
It cannot be seen at home and the recording will not show that.
okay. So let me keep going. So, one of the papers I found in my mother's boxes was a naturalization of George Rymph. You see it down at the bottom, R-I-M, 1763, as a British citizen, of course, because we were not a country this year. And excuse me, if you're ever looking, if you know where the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club is along the Hudson, I know most of you folks probably do, just north of the Vanderbilt estate, that's the land they own. That's where the house was built. If you go there today, it was the second house built in Hyde Park, made out of stone. You will still see over and above, and let me just move along to that. Back, I'm going to go the right way, James. This is the house. You can see it from the road. Back in those days, they also had mile markers, as you can see along the road, telling you so many miles from Albany or New York City. Quite often, once, at least or twice a month, my wife and I will go over and go to that house. You can walk right down to an overlook over the Hudson. Yes? Do you want me? And when they owned that land, it was also part of what's now the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club, so they could go right out to the water. Johannas was a boat captain. He was a farmer.
Press that button.
And you throw up on the screen here. There you go. There's a house. Okay, we did it. And a farmer, a boat captain. He owned a variety of boats and would take his apples down to New York City. And there were plans later on for this house. Let me get back here. This also shows just where it was, just north of the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club. And there were plans a few years ago to make this into quite a nice looking event place. The plans never went through. And I'll just talk in a moment about, where it was transferred to the house and like that. And it just never took place, so the house is still there. About this time, they also met a person whose name was Reuben Spencer. And probably a lot of you have never heard of Reuben Spencer, and I think this will be one of the things we'll take away here tonight that's really important to the town of Clinton. Reuben Spencer is a surveyor by trade, a farmer to make ends meet. Later on, in fact, he's such a good surveyor that his family, I think it was his son, becomes the official surveyor for New York City. He's built the first house on our road, Rymph Road. It was not Rymph Road at the time. It was just a trail, an old wagon trail like most of them were, because you have to keep in mind there was no delineation between Hyde Park and Clinton at the time. They really weren't formed like that. So he lived out here. He was a surveyor. He met Johannas. They became friendly, and probably if I had to give an educated guess, it would be because those different lots that you saw earlier, as they were cut off, he might have been a surveyor who did it. Well, in any event, Reuben Spencer and Johannas became friends, and they would visit now and then. And my family was starting to move away from the Hudson. I do not know why, but they were moving away. So they kept. The land was kept there into, forget the date, but here in 1910, George Rymph is at that property on the Hudson selling his apples down in New York City. Like I say, he has his own boats and things of that nature. But they really wanted to move out to the town of Clinton, away from that area. So there was also a person, while I'm still into Hyde Park, because I do want to move into Clinton. Let me get back here. Nope, I don't see that one. So, I don't know about you, but do you ever wonder at times, like, why you get a certain idea to do something and you don't know, like, where it came from? Was it maybe from your relatives because they thought and did certain things? And I had no idea, as I say, about my great-great-great-great-grandparents and what they did, because some people in the family are more industrious than others. And I knew nothing about that. These folks were in the boat business or that they sold apples, things of that nature. And one day in 1982, I'm down in Florida and I see a boat for sale. And I bought it. So I come home and mention to my wife, and she hates this stuff, that we bought a boat. And she thought maybe water skiing or whatever. Well, not quite, honey. This was the boat. And we brought it up. It used to be one of the original Jungle Queens out of Fort Lauderdale. So I'm kind of wondering that I get that idea because my relatives in the past had boats. They ran boats. We ran this boat, my wife Lori, her children who are here, Heidi, Ramon, Gwen, who's out in the state of Washington, worked on there for 14 years up and down the Hudson. And I can tell you it's a lot more fun than practicing law. And ran that boat. And all these years, from 82 to 94, 96 when we sold it, we went right past the land that was owned by the Rymph family. I never knew it. And just kind of an interesting thing, doesn't mean a lot to you folks, but it does to us.
How many people have been on that boat?
I got a captain's license. Oh, I'm sure some people in this room, I can't tell you, people that still come up to us and remember that boat. They were out on it. How many people were in this room were on that boat? We had a few hands go up. We run into people all the time. The boat business is actually owned by my wife. She still will see people who say, "Aren't you the boat lady?" And she gets a laugh out of it. But we eventually sold it for a variety of reasons, just because the time had come and it ruined or something. And it's unfortunate it's not running out there now. But we had a wonderful time. So there's this fellow named Buttons, and I just shared this because from the article in the New York Times in September of 1899. Buttons is this hobo who wanders around up and down in New York State, and he stops at various places. And where I had the arrow there, it points out he would stop at the Rymphs, the Livingstons, the Vanderbilts, Roosevelts, things like that. He was a very jealous hobo. He didn't like anybody else invading his territory. One day he disappeared, and nobody knows whatever happened to him, but just kind of an interesting commentary. So moving forward, when George dies, and by the way, in 1791, when he passed away, his will is down here in the surrogate's office. I actually read it, and that's where I got this to type it up from. And to show what kind of control he had, which also led me to concur that his wife was an attractive woman, he allows her, Mary, to stay in the house so long as she lives as my widow. What a prince, what a great guy. So otherwise, everything goes to the estate, and mostly starting with the boys. That's just the way it was back then. The camp along the Hudson at one time was sold to the Dominican camp. Some of you folks may have heard of that. This land right next to the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club. It was a camp originally for girls and boys, then for boys. And like I say, it's still there until it was sold by Estelle Rymph later on. Somebody spent an awful lot of time, let me just reach for some stuff here. When I was searching through my mother's boxes there, I found this, and somebody spent time from Johannas George Rymph going forward. There must have been 8 pages of this. The time that this person spent, starting way at the top, going down with everybody off, is absolutely incredible. It stops, I forget at what year, but I just wanted to show it to you. So I just thought it was interesting the time that someone would spend on a family like the Rymphs, leading on down to where they are and where they came from. So this is George W. Of course, it's a George and his wife. And at this point, we do have pictures, and I can tell you for certain they did not have 11 children. And certain people are really movers and shakers in a family. And you've probably seen it. You might have three brothers in a family, and one of them really stands out, and the other two just. George W. is the one who really, in our family, stood out. He was a tax collector in Hyde Park. Then he became town judge in Hyde Park. And later on, when I talk about community service, just for a little bit, I will mention that he was involved with the Poughkeepsie Moose Lodge, the Dutch Reformed Church, Farmers Cooperative, an officer in the Huguenot Bank in New Paltz. And while doing all that, he took care of the farm along the river. And it was after he passed away that his wife, Estelle, sold it to the Dominican camp folks. This just kind of gives you an idea, since we're in the town of Clinton, with all the Rympphs going on. I mean, when the Rympphs, the Buds and the Cookinghams came here, and it was like a little group of rabbits. You look at that list of all those people. I mean, it's incredible the amount that they had. And this shows with George Rymph, the picture I just showed you. Fortunately for me, he at least had two children. So we have James G. Rymph, who's my grandfather, my mother Marguerite, and on the other side, George, Bobby George's, H, George L, James and Judy, who were twins. We had a number of twins in the family also, which is kind of unusual. And Judith, in fact, her son is here tonight. I'll talk about that in a couple of moments. And over here, my mother had two children, myself, my sister. And you notice how polite I am. I do not put her date of birth in there. It's the real gentlemanly thing to do. And she would also cause me a lot of harm if I did it. So I just decided I would be wise. This is what usually people ask me about when they talk about the Rympphs, the Rymph feed store. And there was one of the members of our family, Marshall Rymph, who was a real entrepreneur. And he, at one time, and a fellow named Maston had the Maston and Rymph feed store. And Marshall, in addition to having this feed store, also owned a number of apartments, a number of buildings. If anybody in the family would be, like I said, the entrepreneur type, it would be him. One of his daughters was Emma May. I can remember as a young person going into that Rymph feed store. Some of you may have also on Salt Point Turnpike. And you always had this really fat cat sitting on the counter where you paid. And that cat didn't care who came in. It was just a really warm, friendly thing to see. Emma, who weighed 75 pounds maybe, called her sis. She would throw a 50-pound bag of feed over her shoulder and walk out of that store with you. I still have very fond memories of it. Now there's a big solar panel thing behind it on Salt Point Turnpike, but people always ask me about it, so I just thought I would mention it. And this shows, again, going down to one of the James Rymphs, down through Marshall Rymph, and then down to Emma May, or Sis as we called her, who had the feed store. So it's at about this time that my family, who have made friends with Reuben Spencer. And as I said, Reuben Spencer, not a lot of people know about. Reuben Spencer came here in the 1700s with his family, and it's the first house on the road. In about 1771, Reuben is asked if he will survey the Ohio Territory by the Continental Congress with another surveyor named Washington. And so he and George is a big name, you notice back in those days. So he and George Washington take off for the Ohio Territory, because we were trying to annex it as a country in those days. Fends off the French, the Indians, and they survey the Ohio Territory and become friends. About the time we're getting back here, the relationship with England has hit a low with King George. And of course, Washington is asked to head the Continental Army, which he does. He has Reuben Spencer named a captain in the 4th Regiment out of New York. And we go off to war. I mention all that to you because at some point, Reuben Spencer comes back, and that little house that you see down there is what that house looks like today. The one part you can see is almost the same over on the left. And my grandfather mentioned to me, which I'm glad to have an opportunity to share it, that I forget what year it was in the 1800s, the little house that you see before was moved up the road by mule and wagon. And just the thought of moving that little house up the road to where it currently sits at 132 Rymph Road, it's a major production. But they did it. They did it because they were building a much bigger house behind it, and that was going to become the tenant house. So Reuben Spencer comes back here after the war, surviving the French and Indians, surviving the British, only to be thrown off his horse on our road when the horse is spooked by a black bear. Apparently survives overnight. He's in terrible pain and dies the next day. These two gravestones that you see, the one on the left is Reuben Spencer. It has on there his date of birth, his date of death in 1806. His wife declines to be the executrix of the estate, frankly has no interest in the land. And they had a number of children also. The land passes to one of the daughters and her husband. She dies about 8 months later and is buried next to him. And it's kind of interesting sometimes what people will put on a stone. At the top it has her name, Elizabeth Spencer Relict, R-E-L-I-C-T, which basically widow of Captain Reuben Spencer. Then she has this down at the bottom. You can barely make it out on hers. Stop, my children, hold thy tear. You soon must join your parents here. Those graves are still on our road up a little ways in from the Revolutionary War. For a number of years, the VA would come up and put flags on the graves. They stopped doing it. I think it'd be a nice idea if they did it back. I think it'd be nice if all that was much better preserved. I can remember as a young person going into that graveyard, and there were a couple other graves that was just one name on them. I was wondering if that was one of the children or what it was. And later on, my grandfather informed me that no, there were a couple of his dogs that died. So they got buried along with Captain Spencer and Elizabeth. Well, it was about this time that my grandparents were really interested in the land, in one of the land. Spencer had died along with his wife. But it also got me thinking about it because I know that my great-great-great-grandfather was good friends with Reuben Spencer. I knew Reuben Spencer was good friends with George Washington. So if I'm thinking like Congressman Santos, what's the chance that Washington's up here visiting Reuben Spencer and my grandfather's there, right? We know Washington came up here. He slept up at the Beekman Arms. We see those signs, but the guy slept around a lot. We know he slept there. And maybe because he was slow by horse and wagon, he might have slept at Reuben Spencer's home. And so you can honestly tell people that you've heard talk that George Rymph and George Washington may have met. Both had the same first names, as does Santos, unfortunately. So, in any event, but there's the shows Captain Reuben Spencer quite clearly. Unfortunately, that grave site has gotten worse than it looks right now, and it should be cleaned up so it could look a lot better. All right, going back to the two brothers, George and James Rymph. On the right is James, my grandfather, and on the left is George. And those are really the two, in this area who, the families are here, and I'll show you a little bit more in a sec, who grew up here, were good friends. There were also two girls who were born. One died in infancy and the other in childbirth. So we just left with the two boys. This shows what happens with age. There's my grandfather a few years later, and my grandmother. At the time, they were living on the road. She was a school teacher here in Poughkeepsie, by the way, and he was just a farmer. And he farmed the land. We had cattle. I can remember the cattle very well. And this was my mom, Marguerite. Somehow she escaped being named Mary. And somehow you can't see her up there on a horse. But down here, whatever that's set up on the computer, my mom. So now, as part of the farm, the Rymph Brothers Dairy existed in this area. And I have with me tonight a bottle, which if anybody wants to look at it later, one of the very few given to me by the O'Hara family, Rymph Brothers Dairy, Statsburg, New York, back in the days that they had a dairy. That is, of course, long gone. I could also remember though as a young kid coming up here, milking cows with my grandfather. A number of feral cats in a barn squirt a little milk over there. They would go after it. It's just very fond memories. So, back in those days, by the way, on the farm, let me see if I can find it here. The taxes were a bit less. Here we have $83 in taxes for the land tax on the farm, and that was in 1938. And school tax, 143 acres with the farm, you got $48. Well, I found that again in my mother's stuff. So things have changed a tad here. So this is the farmhouse that you folks saw that was shown on a brochure inviting everybody here tonight. As a look, that's George W. there at the farm with probably a dog that's buried along with the captain, and showing the farmhouse as it looked in those days. And so I have, this is maybe a little audience participation here. This is a picture of the farmhouse today, taken a couple of months ago. My question, and let me go back to the other one for a moment. My question for you is, what difference do you see between these two pictures other than the man and the dog? The well down by the road. When I saw that all my years as a kid, I thought, what's the well doing down there? You know, common sense tells you, first of all, just gravity tells you it's not going to feed the house up on the hill. And that's because this is the house it was used for when it was still that little house before they moved it up the road. So it's interesting things that you just learn as you go along with this. We had a bad fire at the house in 1987. It was basically destroyed. If you come up our road today and see the house, it looks exactly like it did years ago. The job they did putting it back together is fantastic. So this is going to kind of move me into the community service part of it as we're somewhat winding up here my talk about the Rymphs. And you know, community service, it's kind of a hard thing to define. I think it's in the eye of the beholder to a great degree. You look at the volunteers that we have, you know, in our fire department, that's certainly community service. And I can actually make a very good argument that things like Elliot does here in this, you know, in the Historic Society, that Craig, that everybody, Cynthia does, all of that stuff, Rich Morse, the time he spends, it's all community service that helps this community survive. I could probably also make the same argument for the members of our town board. If you look how complicated our society has become and what they do for the small amount they're given, it's community service. The Rymph family had community service back when George W. was a judge in Hyde Park. Poor Mr. Kowalski here shot and wounded an American eagle in 1899. And this is one of the things I found also in the boxes from the warrant issued for his arrest. You don't go shooting an American eagle in Hyde Park. So This is that same note that you saw earlier, so far as people being volunteers. And with us tonight, in fact, is Patrick O'Hara, Judy Rymph's son, and you see George Rymph as the assessor, justice of the peace. And then Judy Rymph, who I will talk about in a moment, was a Hyde Park receiver of taxes. And so far as volunteers, we have Patrick in 1889 to 1890. There was a Rymph who was a town supervisor, which you'll also see a little bit better. I don't know what's happening with the computer with this stuff. It doesn't come out quite as easy. A number of years ago, we honored Ray Oberly for being town supervisor. You may recall that. In fact, we got a bench for him. It's outside the town hall. His many years put in. And after I got done with that project, which our town clerk, Carol Mackin, and I worked on, I was looking around the town hall and I thought, you know, there's no pictures, there's nothing about town supervisors. And effectively, years ago, they volunteered their time. They got very little for it. Most of them served one term, that was it. Then someone else took over and volunteered their time. So I've started to put together a list of everybody going back to when our town was formed, the men and women who have been our town supervisor. I'm still working on it. And you can see in there, 1889 is when John Rymph, for my family, was a supervisor, and then it goes on down. Some of the names you recognize from roads, Halstead Road. And I showed this to Craig because he wasn't aware so far as the involvement with his house, who all had been town supervisors here. Of course, the Schultzes, you got John Schultz and another Schultz. And I just thought it was kind of interesting. Of course, Crookenham on there. We will get it. I have carried it forward past 97. I just didn't bother to show it all. But just to give you an idea, I'm still working on it because one day we don't need pictures, but it'd be nice just to have on a board in the town hall a list of all the former supervisors. It doesn't have to be anything, dramatic, but just be kind of nice to have it there. So that's my next little project I'm planning. So Judith Rymph, she kind of stands out so far as in Hyde Park. She married Peter O'Hara, and as I say, Patrick is here tonight, who, by the way, so far as volunteer time, he's volunteering in the cemetery to help clean up the stones, doing an absolutely beautiful job. He will be talking about that next month or sometime this year, about what he's doing. And you see some of those stones that I remember from a year or two ago, you could hardly read anything on them. It looked like they were just done yesterday. A fantastic job. It's a real expertise. But Judy Rymph became the longest tenured official in the town of Hyde Park. She was elected like the 8 4-year terms. You're talking 30-something years, both by Republicans and Democrats. And that's something in a small town, which also speaks to this town, that you cross party lines for the right person. So I just wanted to bring that up as part of a story of the Rymphs. So as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of made up of bookends and in our lives. And at the end of my bookend, I know where I'm going to be. The land for the Pleasant Plains Cemetery was given to the cemetery by the Rymph family, a piece of it, and the Crookenham family, a piece of it. And so I know at the end where I will end up in general and more specific with my relatives. So in winding up, I hope you have learned at least something about the town you didn't know. I want to thank the Historic Society for giving me an opportunity to present this, and also encourage the Historic Society. I would imagine there's other families in town who've been here a long time could tell you some history that you and I have no knowledge of. And the other thing I want to do is I really have to thank Sue DiLorenzo and John Golden, who I mentioned it turns 100 in May. Thank them both for actually getting me to do this. And if you haven't done it with your family, I would really, I really encourage you to do so, because We all have our own quirks, our own idiosyncrasies. When I go up to that cemetery today and I look at those relatives, I know who to blame. You? So that is it. I want to thank all of you, but don't run away yet because we do have a presentation in a moment or two. Mr. Clark.
We have a famous name in our family too, the Chase name.
If you have a famous name in your family, the Chase name.
Chase. But there are no more Chases because they didn't have, all they had was girls. So
They didn't tangle with girls?
No, they didn't end up having male sons.
Oh, they all had girls.
Just like Lincoln. There's no Lincolns from Abraham Lincoln. My question is, are there any Rymphs around still?
There are Rymphs around. My cousin Jim Rymph lives on Fork Hill Road. There's shockingly a George Rymph. Right across from the rear entrance to the Vanderbilt estate is where George Rymph lives. Chad, sorry, apologize. Chad Rymph lives there with his family. And George Rymph used to live there. That's where I got it from. I remember George there. In fact, my mother and father had a house right next door there for a while. Yes, there are boys. On my side of it, it ends. I look out west. My daughter Gwen, Guinevere, I think, is watching this. 2 sons, Logan and Annabelle, but it's not going to be a Rymph. And the same with my sister. Her 2 children are in Florida. Her daughter's in Florida with 2 children, Jessica and Joshua down there, but it's not a Rymph. So when I did the talk for Hyde Park, their pamphlet that advertised it had something like the Rymph family hanging on by a thread. So, yeah, there's less. There's less, but that's the way it goes. That's why I'm glad I had the chance to share this. Yes, sir.
Did the original Rymph form
Repeat the question.
Did the original Rymph farm go all the way down to Fork Hill Road? On Rymph Road, once they got the land from Reuben Spencer, it stopped a ways down, didn't go right to Fork Hill. There was land they owned down right where the Pleasant Plains Church is, because they gave that land for the cemetery, and it was farming down there, and they had the dairy. So, but not down onto Fork Hill itself.
Any other questions?
No questions from Zoom. I have a question. No questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
The camp that was on the river.
Dominican camp on the river, yes.
Dominican camp, yeah, that was a Rymph.
That was the Rymph property. Estelle sold that, which was George W., the real mover in our family. He had owned it after Johannas. It came down 1 generation in between, then to him. And then she sold it to the Dominican camp. One other little thing is just I find it interesting within the family. Once the Rymphs got the farmland where we're on, from Reuben Spencer, actually his heirs, it had to be purchased. And Marshall Rymph, who was the real entrepreneur, apparently gave the money and took a mortgage out from the other Rymphs who didn't pay. So my grandfather got the property in foreclosure from another Rymph. It's just kind of, I don't want to share. Like I say, some of those stories from also having represented Rymphs over the years. When I said, when you talk about the Rymphs, not necessarily.
I'm just curious, what's the owl?
What's the owl all about? My mother was like the penultimate bird watcher. She would be up at 5 o'clock in the morning, out on an owl walk. She belonged to the John something Bird Society, Waterman Bird Society. She knew what every piece of grass, every piece of had a name. She was so into all of that stuff. She also had 2 Siamese cats that nobody liked, who accompanied her right where you're looking at. So she's there with 2 Siamese cats. Anybody else?
Okay, thank you.
You want to do the other piece?
I'll bring it over.
Okay, so what we have, and Lori, come on up. You can give our friend here a hand. Some people might not be able to see it. Don't drop.
Okay, got it.
Oh, you can leave it right. Oh, okay, you can leave it right on there. Good. The more you carry it, the more chance. Okay, so if you buy a piece of property today, you're going to get a readout from the clerk. You get your deed. Fine. Back in 1791, if you knew people who knew people, you could get a deed signed by the governor of the state. And we happen to have such a deed. This deed is from 1791, and it also has the governor's seal on it. So this is it. If you want to come up and take a look at it, watch it doesn't fall. We are donating this to the Clinton Historic Society. The only little downside for me is that it's not land in Clinton. It's another, what was a county, Montgomery County. But what's really neat about it, it's 1791, and down at the bottom it says, signed by George Clinton, our governor of our state, general and commander-in-chief of the militia, admiral of the navy, at the city of New York on the 8th day of July, in the year of our Lord, 1791, in the 15th year of our independence. And it's just really kind of neat to have something like that. Like I say, since the town's named after him, it's the Clinton Historic Society. So I told Craig we would donate it here. We would find a spot to see it. You just don't find them with that seal. So that's it.